going to turn this part of the meeting over as we do the Distinguished Service Award, and I'm going to ask our chairman of the Distinguished Service Award Committee, David Warner, to come forward and take charge. David?
Thank you. The Ontario Association of Former Parliamentarians created a Distinguished Service Award. This award to be handed out to a former member who has distinguished himself or herself in public life and is still living. This year, the award is being given to Bob Nixon. And I'm going to ask the Premier to come forward and to accept this award on Bob's behalf. You want me to read it? Chair thinks that I can read. Yeah. Distinguished Service Award on behalf of the people of Ontario, the Ontario Association of Former Parliamentarians recognizes the Honourable Robert Fletcher Nixon. A graduate of McMaster University and the University of Toronto, Robert Nixon entered political life in 1962, representing the provincial riding of Brant. In 1967, he was acclaimed as party leader and leader of the official opposition. In 1987, he was appointed Deputy Premier. Following his retirement from the provincial parliament, he served as chair of the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and in 1992 was named Agent General of Ontario in the United Kingdom. The association salutes our colleague for his years of wise counsel to the Parliament and the people of Ontario.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. And I'm really honored and kind of humbled to be here to accept this award on behalf of Bob Nixon. So I appreciate it. C'est un tel honneur que d'accepter ce prix au nom de Bob Nixon. I know and you all know how much he would have loved to be here himself. And if he could have, he would have been. There's nothing that Bob likes better than having a chance to share old war stories. People are nodding some war stories and offer his perspective on today's politics, a perspective which he holds and expresses regularly. He sends emails to members of my staff, actually, on almost daily basis. So he's still got those opinions, and it's fantastic. He's almost 85 years old, and his electronic updates demonstrate that he has lost none of his wit nor his political savvy. And these missives they're just a tiny demonstration of the role that he's played in public life since leaving the legislature in 1991. As you all know, Bob was a long-standing member of the provincial legislature. He acted as interim party leader, deputy premier, finance minister. He was a faithful steward of the party, but he also continually demonstrated his willingness to work across party lines for the public good. And that's the spirit, I think, that is being celebrated. He didn't back down from a fight, but he didn't draw lines in the sand or reject the idea that progress could be made through a spirit of cooperation. After leaving Queen's Park, Bob continued his commitment to public service with an appointment to review Atomic Energy of Canada, which David just mentioned, where he would later be appointed chairman. And there he worked with leaders in nuclear energy to foster innovation and scientific research in Canada, while ensuring the health and safety of our citizens and our environment, all at the same time. He served as Ontario's Agent General in London, England, appointed by NDP Premier at the time, Bob Rae, and he reviewed a plan to renovate Pearson International Airport, where his recommendations would lead to an airport improvement strategy that did service to taxpayers and tourists alike. I think what's distinctive about Bob's contributions is that they remind us all of our shared goals, not just as politicians, but as people of this province, as residents of Ontario. We all want Ontario to grow and prosper. Ce qu'il y a distinct à propos des contributions de Bob, c'est que cela nous rappelle nos objectifs communs à la fois en tant que politiciens et en tant que citoyens de cette province. Nous voulons tous et toutes que l'Ontario progresse et prospère. We all want a fair society. We want a fairer society where everyone has a chance to realize their full potential. We want our families to be healthy and happy and our future to be bright. And Bob understood that those goals are nonpartisan. Those are objectives that we all share. And that while we have our own particular perspectives on those goals, we can work effectively together to secure a bright future for the people of Ontario. So I want to thank Bob for all his hard work and his tireless dedication, for his regular emails and his continued passion for the process of politics. And I wish him and his wife Dorothy health and happiness as they continue to share treasured moments with their family on the farm. I also want to thank all the former parliamentarians for bestowing him with this honor and for continuing to serve the people of Ontario well. Thank you for showing us the way, for showing us our responsibility to the public doesn't end with our time in office. Ontario is a stronger province because of the role you've played, and your contributions will remain a source of strength for years to come. So on Bob's behalf, I'm so honored to accept this award for him today. Thank you very much. Merci, miigwech. Yeah, okay, so Canon Shea is going to take it to him, or we can, okay.
We're going to take it up to him, and we'll charge the taxi fare to your office. Thank you, Premier, so much. So great words. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. That looks terrific. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Well done, David. You did a good job. You and Lily and everybody else working with you did a great job. Thank you so much. Appreciated that. A couple of words be spoken as well. Let's call upon, let me turn to Eli Martel. Eli, come up here and say something about the former Deputy Premier. You're most welcome. Okay.
Premier, I couldn't be that short if I tried. And Floyd tells me if I go past 10 minutes, he's going to start to heckle. And that would be like being at home. It's an honor to be here today to address a few remarks about a man who devoted his adult life to public service. I met Bob in '68, having been elected in the September election of '67, and that was the 25th anniversary, by the way, of the Tory dynasty. But that started a trend. Thank God it eventually ended. Obviously, in my first weeks in the Ledge, I learned some things about Bob Nixon. First of all, he had a wide range of knowledge, and he could raise questions in the legislature in a really significant way, and he was up to date on the issues. He was also a capable debater. I was always amazed at Nixon. He would be in the House with maybe a little slip of paper and carry on. He and Stephen Lewis were probably the two best. But they could debate, but you have to remember, Premier, that in those days, the Speaker didn't allow you to have notes in front of you. You were chastised and told to get off your notes and carry on, and that went on frequently. The other thing I enjoyed about meeting Bob, he had 3 or 4 Liberals who were really smart, but man, oh man, they were loose cannon. And I used to kid Bob all the time and ask him how he can... I'm not talking about you, Pat. I'll get to you in a minute. Anyway, it was always amazing about... and he could control them, but boy, I could tell you lots of stories about that, but I won't. As I said, the Speaker was really tough in those days, and he cut you off. Now, Bob demonstrated for me tremendous respect for the legislature itself, its officers, and the standing orders. And With the increased number of members that came in the first year I was here, the outdated rules really played havoc with the House. And part of the problem was that everything was done in the legislature almost. And you had a bunch of young new members who could really blow off a lot of steam. And there wasn't enough work, actually, because most of the work was done in the House, as Huey Eddinghofer would remember, and there was too much free time waiting for your kick at the can. And boy, that was a recipe for disaster. Things changed about 5 or 6 years into this chaos, the arguments that went on daily. A committee was appointed to review the rules, the legislature itself, the library that we had at the time, which was an awful place, television in the legislature, and the 7-committee report. I was part of that committee. We agreed to look at the legislature not from where we sat in the House, but how we wanted the legislature to work competently and so on. And it was interesting. Pretty well all the guys appointed to that committee had 6 to 8, 9 years. And it really made a difference. And we finally got a unanimous report, and that was important. And I'm going to come to it because what those rules did, they recognized the rights of the government. They also recognized the rights of the opposition. And much of the chaos that existed at the time or developed disappeared once we brought the new rules in. And the rules allowed us flexibility in the order of business. And changing the business couldn't occur without the opposition and having total consent. And that was important too. You know, it reached a point that members could go to dinner together, and there were lots of groups who went to dinner together, and you could discuss things. And when Nixon became the House leader, we had time to talk about things that affected members. And one night, in our discussions, the 3 House leaders, we realized that not having a pension, the Canada pension we were excluded from, we didn't vote it out of existence like some party that did, and I like to shove that up. And so we decided we'd go out and have dinner together and we'd talk about severance pay. Because in those days, as you know, you got defeated, your salary stopped that day. And you could be in the House 10, 12 years, and if you were defeated, you had no income. You couldn't even get unemployment insurance. But it was horrible stuff. So we went to dinner, and with the aid of a couple of refreshments, we finally agreed, and the 3 of us were House leaders, we'd take it to the Board of Internal Economy, a 3-month severance pay package. And then we had a couple toasts to that, you see. And then we came back to the night sitting. And as we got close to the chamber, I said to my 2 colleagues, I'm going home. They didn't follow my advice. They went into the legislature, and they were there about 5 or 6 minutes when the Speaker suggested to both Bob Welch and Bob Nixon that they might want to retire early for the evening. And they both did. You know, thank God. You know, House leaders in those days, and they still do, I guess, they met regularly, they met irregularly, and they met at Board of Internal Economy meetings. And we learned a good deal about each other. And there were some wonderful House leaders. When you talk about Nixon, you talk about Bob Welch, you talk about Tom Wells. I mean, you couldn't work with better people. And I learned, for example, that Bob had a great sense of humor. But I also learned when he started to get red about here, he wasn't saying much, but it was just spread. And you knew Bob was going to blow. He didn't do it very often, but he did it occasionally. and you knew it was coming. You were forewarned by the color of his complexion. I used to go down to Bob's office once in a while. He'd come to my office. And in Bob's office, the desk was clear. There wasn't a piece of paper on his desk. There was a telephone, and he had this picture of the garage where he and his cronies used to meet. And he enjoyed that. But nothing. And I used to be green with envy. My desk was just cluttered with junk. And I was trying to, Bob didn't have a thing there. And I could never understand how he could be ready to do things and there wasn't a piece of paper around. And I was green with envy, I must tell you. And we used, I must say that my friends were willing, and we used the notes prepared from the House Leaders meetings by my assistant, Avril Mitchell. Avril could take shorthand as fast as you could talk, and her notes were absolutely perfect. And we started just to accept them, including my friend Nixon. And I remember one night, and we used to have these Board of Internal Economy meetings, and one night we had a lengthy one. I mean lengthy, about 3 hours. And at the end, Nixon said to me, he said, God, I got to use a washroom, Eli. And I said, so do I, Bob. And we headed into the first washroom we came to. And as we went in and we went past the stalls, the toilet stalls, I saw a pair of red high heels. And there were 2 feet in them. And I grabbed Bob by the arm. I said, I think we're in the wrong place. And he looked down, and we bolted from the place. And we were terribly embarrassed. Here we've been in this place for years. We got lost in the woman's washroom. But it worked out. I want to quote you because the election of 85, I guess it was an interesting time. And I'm looking for page 135 in Rosemary Spear's book, because there's a thing I want to read to you. It's very short. On the day after the election, Bob Nixon called up Martel in Sudbury to find out how New Democrats were feeling. And he broke into a laughter when he heard Martel's son answer the phone, found out who it was, and dropping the phone, ran through the house calling out, Dad, Dad, it's a coalition. And after his conversation with Nixon, Martel felt that the NDP should move swiftly. And I want to tell you, I was one of those, my friend Ross McClellan, who fought like hell to either have a coalition or let it go. Because I wouldn't give power, if I could, to somebody to become the government for a few tidbits. I say that, Premier, not to be mean either. But when you're giving someone power, you're entitled to a real chunk of the action. And I know people don't believe that, but that's my belief. And I know you might think the demands are a lot at the time, but then ask what it's up against. Power and government and giving the opposition a few tidbits. And it was, and I lost the battle, and Ross lost the battle, and our 3 Italian friends here in Toronto, because they had seen, they had seen coalition governments in Europe. And I think the day's got to come that we move to that sort of system, because what's going on in Canada and in the Ontario legislature just frightens the hell out of me. I say that not to be mean either. There's no friendship. It's bitterness. It's the worst you can see. And I'm not trying to lecture. I'm just frustrated what I see. And I think something like proportional representation will change it all. And it's going to come. I want to say, as I wind up, I enjoyed my time with Nixon. And as I watch from the legislature, from the sidelines these days, I've watched rule change and the schedule changes done by government, unilaterally. That's chaos. That's a recipe for disaster, because it means government has no consideration for the opposition at all. And Bob Nixon wasn't built like that. Bob Nixon respected the legislature and the people in the legislature. Might always not get your way, but that's what he was all about. And that's what we should be about, you know. Government should be for all of the people. I eulogized my friend Bob Elgee 3 weeks ago. And one of the things Bob was noted for, his resentment that parties cater only to their own people and not to all of the people. And I thought that what democracy was about. It doesn't resemble that these days. I want to conclude by saying that because of Bob's great respect for the legislature, its officers, its standing orders, I'm convinced he wouldn't be happy with what's going on today. He would be terribly unhappy. He demonstrated over a lifetime service, dedication, concern, and respect for people. People of Ontario, his colleagues in the legislature, and I want to congratulate Bob for demonstrating that and giving us that. His was a great contribution. And in conclusion, I want to say he couldn't have done it without his partner, Dorothy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eli. That was very helpful and honest. Premier, thank you very much for being here. Hopefully, Eli, some of the sentiments that you express are reflected in this association where we try to be apolitical and reach across all the lines. And I appreciated your words. Thank you. Is that Norm? Stand up, Norm. Norm, we have done the presentations, but you were to make a few words about Bob Nixon, and would you come forward and do that now, please? Do you have your notes with you? Got your glasses with you? All right. Have you got your cane? All right, please.
I assume that other people have already made their remarks, have they?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to conclude with exactly what Bob Nixon said when he left the legislature. I don't know if you remember or any were there. The Speaker gave him the opportunity, and typical, practical, straightforwardness of Bob Nixon, he said, "Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak here." And he says, "I'm out of here. Thank you."
I lost a bet, Norm. We didn't think you could do it. Well done. Well done. Thank you. Welcome to everybody for our dinner tonight. And I have some special guests I would like to introduce. We'll hold our applause. I just want to make sure that they are properly recognized by our association as we gather for our 13th annual dinner. Many of you have had a chance to already meet our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Wong. There'll be more said about him a little later on. It'll take about half an hour to go through his entire bio. Dr. Linda Asper, who's the president of the Manitoba former members of the Legislative Assembly. Linda's here. We are welcoming the Consul General who just came in from the Consul of India. I welcome you, as a matter of fact. Welcome to be with us. Yes, I think we're allowed to applaud for the Consuls General. Yeah. The rest of us will keep silent. Leo Duque had to leave. He's the president of the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians. He had to leave along with his colleagues. Ali Richa Güney is here from Turkey. Nice to have you with us as well, the Consul General. Representing the U.S. Consul General is David Kay. David? We have somebody most of us know one way or the other, but I must say also, I want to say thank you to him in a special way. Our Speaker of the House, the Honourable David Levesque. I want to say, yeah. Now you're going to applaud again. because in fact he's provided some of our wine for tonight. So, typical Ontarians. All right, here we go. All right, here we go. All right, let's all get drunk. There we go. I introduce Portia Mayer, who's the Consul General of Australia. Nice to have you with us, Portia. I always like to welcome Graham Murray from inside Queen's Park. Where are you, Murray? Oh, there you are. Good. Good to have you with us. And the others were representing the Canadian Association, and I think they've succeeded and they've left. So we're going to eat and drink their supplies. I'm going to call upon Karen to give a very quick membership update. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights when I just said that. So we'll do that, and then we're going to proceed to our Distinguished Service Award.
Is there anyone here at dinner who didn't make it to our annual meeting this afternoon? Only you? Oh, David, you're here too. I just want to mention that we're so appreciative of those people who volunteer to serve on committees within our organization, because it is from those committees that we build up our directorship here for the association. Our membership is standing at 132. We're very, very pleased with that. And we did ask you to take a look at the list of those that may be missing in action. We're trying to catch everyone who is still alive and is a former member, and that sounds terrible, I know. How do you tell? I know. Oh, will we? Thank God you're not the membership chair, Steve. So if you have information about some of our former members that we have not got listed, we do have a list of those we're trying to search out. So our membership is very, very good. We thank you for continuing to be members. We think it's very important, and we welcome you to renew again next year, and you'll be getting letters from us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. I do want to echo that one point, that if you would like to volunteer, there are a number of committees, but they do meet. So it's not a matter of being a member of a committee and never turning up again. There is work to be done. So if you're interested, I would suggest you take Karen aside and offer your interest, and she may be able to pair you up with a committee that's of interest to you. She'll also be able to give you some idea of how much time is involved in that committee work. Let's move on to the Distinguished Service Award. So those who were at our meeting this afternoon, we had, I think, a very wonderful presentation at that time. The award was received on behalf of Robert Nixon by the Honorable Kathleen Wynne. And we appreciated that very much, that she was there and could speak to receive it. But there are some who were not at that meeting this afternoon, so we thought it was important to make a brief presentation again this evening. And I'll ask the chair of the Distinguished Service Award Committee if David will come forward and read the plaque, and then proceed on with Patrick Reed, who's going to give a 37-second greeting.
You haven't heard Patrick's speeches then. It is a great privilege and honor as chair of the committee to announce that this year's recipient of the Distinguished Service Award is Bob Nixon. I had the privilege of serving in the House during part of that time, and a truly remarkable parliamentarian, and it was a unanimous decision on behalf of the committee. And I will read this, the award as it's in front of me. Distinguished Service Award on behalf of the people of Ontario, the Ontario Association of Former Parliamentarians recognizes the Honorable Robert Fletcher Nixon, a graduate of McMaster University and the University of Toronto. Robert Nixon entered political life in 1962, representing the provincial riding of Brant. In 1967, he was acclaimed as party leader and leader of the official opposition. In 1987, he was appointed deputy premier. Following his retirement from the provincial parliament, he served as chair of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and in 1992 was named Agent General of Ontario in the United Kingdom. The association salutes our colleague for his years of wise counsel to the Parliament and the people of Ontario. And to receive this award on behalf of Bob is the last representative of the Liberal Labour Party from the riding of Rainy River. Yeah, and you heard the call of resign many times from that corner of the House. Patrick Reid.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
I'll leave that with you.
All right, there's my speech. Thank you all for coming.
It's not Norm Sterling.
Almost as good as Norm's. Just before I begin and talk about Robert Fletcher Nixon, whom I used to call Fletch when I was mad at him, I just realized, because I'm almost as old as some of you here, that I graduated from the University of Manitoba, St. Paul's College, 50 years ago this year. And as a coincidence, I ran into Linda Van Barker, she is now Asper, and Leo Duguay, who were also at the same college as I was in those days, the two guests that were here today. So you have to be careful what you say about people. When I told Bob that I had been asked to say some words about him at this gathering, his response was, "I will be watching with my lawyers." It's one thing a lot of people didn't realize. Bob really had a great sense of humor, except during caucus. But the Nixon family history is remarkable. And I can't think of any other family that has given so much to public service. Harry Corwin Nixon was elected in 1919, served in the United Farmers government, became a progressive after that, became a liberal cabinet minister in Mitch Hepburn's government, became premier in 1943, after having a fight and standing up for the principles of democracy against Mitch Hepburn, because Mitch Hepburn wanted to appoint Harry Corwin Nixon as premier to follow him. And Harry said, "No, that is not your decision, it's the people's decision," and resigned. And subsequently, the caucus threw Mitch out, and Harry became the premier in 1943. That's a very poignant year for me. My father ran for the provincial Liberals in 1943 and lost. And I was born in 1943, and my father was fond of saying nothing went right in 1943. He had a rotten sense of humor. The other interesting thing is, and I'm going to sound like Brian Mulroney, I'm talking about myself instead of Bob, but we've heard so much about him today, who cares anymore, right? I ran 24 years later in 1967. The fellow who defeated my father in 43 for the CCF was a fellow by the name of George Lockhart. The same George Lockhart ran against me, or I ran against him, in 1967. He wasn't the member then. And I beat him by almost the same number of votes that he defeated my father by. A little bit of history. Also, for you history buffs, it was in 1938 that the Ontario legislature changed the title. Up to then, we were called MLAs. In 1938, the legislature passed the resolution changing it to MPP, or Member of Provincial Parliament. I believe that was done to kind of put us a little elevated up with our federal brethren, which we never quite made in salary or pensions. You know, Bob became leader in '67. I was in graduate school. I came in Winnipeg. I came to Toronto for that Liberal gathering. Had my picture taken with Bob, and I'm sure he'd remember this. For those of you who never met him, Bob was about 6'3", at least, had hands like hams, and I was about 5'8", fairly skinny at that time, with zits and hair like this. We looked like Canadian Gothic, you know, if we'd had a pitchfork. Then in that election, and I are just talking to Sean Conway the other night, Bob was the leader, his first election. Robarts was the premier. If Robarts and God were on the ballot, Robarts would have won. So it was pretty tough sledding. And of course, the Liberal Party was basically in the leader's office. Catherine Dysart was Bob's secretary, and there was a young, older lady named Mabel. I'll maybe save that story, it'll go on too long. But it was tough going for the Liberals, and the economy was great. And by the way, none of you are old enough to remember, I think Hugh Eddinghofer is the only, and Eli, who's looking really old, were in '67, guess what the budget of Ontario was? $1.93 billion. When Bob retired in 1990, having been treasurer, he had 2 balanced budgets, and the budget was $41.6 billion. Last year, 2012, the budget of Ontario was $122 billion. And it's amazing how they say work used to expand to fulfill the time necessary for its completion. Well, the budget certainly is expanded, and somebody asked me the other day if we were any better off, but that's another story. Anyway, Bob had a difficulty because all of the Liberals in those days, especially the lawyers, all went to Ottawa because that's where the perks were, that's where the monies were. The Liberals were in power. It was hard to find candidates. And Sean just reminded me the other day that Jim Bradley ran in that election. Is he stuffed or is he still? Yeah, both. Anyway, Jim Bradley, who was 21, apparently beat Mark Chown, I think it was, for the nomination, and he was 21. He was even younger than I. And then Nixon wound up with me at 24. He came to the riding during the election, and we had been solidly trounced by the conservative Bill Noden, who was my predecessor for 16 years. And there wasn't any organization, there wasn't any money, and there was 20,000 square miles to cover. But Bob came up for the nomination, and we decided to blow the wad, and we rented the local movie house for a night and advertised free movies. Come and see Bob Nixon, leader of the Liberal Party, and your candidate, Pat Reid. And it was a Sunday night. It rained. Bob was late getting there. They had started the first movie. And it was, I don't know why this sticks in my mind, it was called Kiss the Girls and Make Them Die. And it was a double feature. And this is for Bob's benefit because he does do farming. The second one, I think, on the bill was the asparagus that ate Brant County. But we had they started the first movie, and Bob and I were in the back, and one of the things a lot of people don't realize about Bob, he was a bit impatient, to say the least. And he said, come on, let's get this goddamn thing going. So we decided to stop the movie. And we walked up the aisle in the dark, got up on the stage. Everybody's booing. All 8 people in the theater. 8 people. That cost us $350, which was over 10% of our budget for that election. Anyway, the end of that story, and then I've got to move on here, was that Bob, or John Mord, who was executive assistant, went back to Queen's Park, because that's where the election was being run out of, and they had a chart there with all the ridings. And somebody drew a line through Rainy River. Because on election night, I won by 41 votes. My mother was here in Toronto. She phoned the office the next day and said, could you tell me what the final vote was in Rainy River? And this nice old lady, her name wasn't Mabel, but something like that, said, well, I'm sorry, there's no such riding as Rainy River. And my mother said, well, yes it is, would you please check? And she didn't say it that nicely, being my mother. And no, there isn't. And how I work here, why are you telling me? I know what the hell's going on here. How do you know there's a Rainy River? My mother said, because my son got elected there last night and slammed the receiver down. Those were different times. You know, there weren't the backroom boys, there wasn't polling, there wasn't big fundraisers. We had no research, we had no secretaries. And so it was a lot different. We didn't have the kind of spin that we get in politics. It was a much more honest, forthright thing. And it reminded me, I came across this just the other day in the paper, and this was actually happened in Australia, not here, but I think it's applicable to what's been going on in our politics in this spin business. And I'm going to read it. Judy Rudd, an amateur genealogy researcher in southeast Queensland, was doing some personal work on her family tree. She discovered that the ex-Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's great-uncle, Remus Rudd, was hanged for stealing and train robbery in Melbourne in 1889. Both Judy and Kevin Rudd share this common ancestor. The only known photograph of Remus shows him standing on the gallows at the Melbourne jail. On the back of the picture, I have it here, Judy obtained during her research this inscription: Remus Rudd, horse thief, sent to Melbourne jail 1885, escaped 1887, robbed the Melbourne Geelong train 6 times, caught by Victoria Police Force, convicted and hanged in 1889. So Judy emailed her cousin, ex-Prime Minister Rudd, for information about their great-great-uncle Remus Rudd. Believe it or not, Kevin Rudd's staff sent back the following biographical sketch for her genealogy research. Remus Rudd was famous in Victoria during the mid to late 1800s. His business empire grew to include acquisitions of valuable equestrian assets and intimate dealings with the Melbourne Geelong Railroad. Beginning in 1883, he devoted several years of his life to government service, finally taking leave to resume his time with the railroad. In 1887, he was a key player in a vital investigation run by the Victoria Police Force. In 1889, Remus passed away at an important civic function held in his honor when the platform upon which he was standing collapsed. Stephen Harper would like to get in touch with these people. I've got too much. I was supposed to have 10 minutes. Eli went on much too long, and they're taking my time off. So I'm just going to say, just remind you of 2 things, and I'm going to tell you things about Bob that people don't know because we've heard most of his political career and his contribution otherwise. So things you don't know about Robert Fletcher Nixon. First of all, he is a movie aficionado. Apparently, he could become a critic, a professional critic, because he knows every movie that was ever made, all the set designers, the actors, etc. He also, quietly, does watercolor painting, which he took up finally when he did retire. He's a farmer. He used to bring asparagus to the legislative dining room on occasion. And when he was Consul General in London, he made a big splash by, instead of taking the usual gifts of booze and things to other consulates, he brought Ontario apples. And that made a huge change in the culture of the whole thing because, and gave Ontario a real boost. There's a story about him in China. Some of you may think that this is Margaret Macmillan's with Nixon in China, the week that changed the world, but Bob and David Peterson went to China, and there was a incident that I'll tell you about later if you want, which almost broke up relationships between China and Ontario over ginseng. I think it's ginseng, not Viagra, Barbara, wasn't it? Yeah. He was a sailor of no note, falling off Bob Wright's Sunfish. You know what a sunfish is. That's a very small boat, and Bob was a very big man. A baker and a cook, a gourmand and a gourmet. When we used to go out for dinners during the break, in those days we sat at nights. We got paid a lot less for doing a lot more, but that's another story. But we were known, Bob, Dickie Smith, Donnie Patterson, myself, we were known as the rounds of the night table. Anyway, some of you, most of you, I presume, have read Steve Pakin's book called The Life. If you haven't read it, it's quite interesting because he asks the question of a lot of members, former members, what is so appealing about the life, as he calls it? Why did any of us run? Why do people keep running? And everybody has a different answer to that. I think the simple answer for most of us is we want to change the world and make things better. But in the Nixon family, Harry Corwin, 1919 to 1961, Bob, 1962, and leader, treasurer, to 1990. His daughter, granddaughter, Jane in Chrétien's government, 1993 to 2004. How many families do you know have given that kind of service to the Canadian public? I believe with that family it was noblesse oblige, pardon me. No, a feeling that you had to give back to the community and you had to help people more fortunate than less fortunate than yourself. And that runs through the whole career of the Nixons. I'm going to end it there, but I find myself for the first time, Eli Martell and I was in the legislature with Eli from 67 to 84 when I quit. I don't think there was one occasion, well, there was one, that I agreed with Eli Martell. Mind you, there probably wasn't more than one occasion when even his fellow NDPers agreed with Eli. And that was about salaries and severance, but Eli did say something today that I agree with about Bob. He brought a civility to the process. He had a great respect for the institution of Parliament. He treated everybody with respect. And that seems, as somebody pointed out earlier, to be lacking in our parliaments, not just here, but in Ottawa and other places today. So I say to him and to Dorothy, because without Dorothy, he would not have been able to do what he did. And I leave you one last thought with that. We used to sit nights sometimes. If the House leader had one too many, he would decide in his cups that we should sit till 1, 2 in the morning. But Bob invariably drove back to St. George and to Dorothy and the kids, and he'd be here the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp. So I would like you to join with me in raising a toast to Robert Fletcher Nixon and to his wife Dorothy. Thank you very much.